This is Rudi Kamera. In the following 15 minutes I will give you a brief introduction to the concept of politeness and how it relates to the training of intercultural communication skills. My guiding questions will be three. Firstly, what do we mean exactly when we speak of politeness? Secondly, is it right to assume that my ideas about being polite will be accepted as such all over the world? Or to put it differently, is politeness universal? That is something we find everywhere. Thirdly, if the answer to the second question is yes, what does this imply? If no, how should we deal with it in practice? The following presentation will try to answer these questions and suggest practical ways of dealing with them. The world is complex and diverse, as everyone knows, yet there seems to be one key factor which greatly affects the success or failure in both intracultural and intercultural environments, that is, being perceived as a polite and trustworthy person. You may even say that more than anything else, in international and intercultural encounters, it is primarily politeness which helps to establish and maintain a positive relationship with people from different cultural backgrounds. We don't need to travel far, however, to find that ideas about what is considered polite and impolite vary. Think of things like dress codes, which may vary from company to company even in one country, or concepts of punctuality, concepts of consensus finding, of negotiation styles, gift giving, and many other things. So how can we deal with the diversity of politeness concepts? Before we can answer this question, we need to have a look at what precisely we mean by politeness. That politeness is a universal phenomenon was suggested by the British sociolinguists Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson, who argued that every human was guided by a positive self-image, on the grounds of which he or she wished to be regarded by others. This they called face. Accordingly, face-saving was considered a core strategy in establishing and maintaining positive relationships with others, while face-threatening signified the opposite. Interestingly, the concept of politeness suggested by Brown and Levinson focuses on the use of language and claims to be universally true. Their approach to examining things connected with politeness has proven extremely influential, so it may be worth looking at some of the details of their analysis. Brown and Levinson distinguish between positive and negative face, and consequently between positive and negative politeness. These terms may perhaps be misleading, since negative politeness does not mean impoliteness, but rather a specific form of politeness. The examples given on this slide may help to understand the difference. Giving a compliment may be seen as an example of positive politeness. An example of negative politeness in British English would be a request like, "Would you mind opening the window?" This question, which can be a suggestion or even an order, implies, by the way it is said, that the person spoken to is free to decide on his or her own, that is, the speaker is not impeding on the other person. The underlying concept is that of personal autonomy. In contrast to this, a direct order such as "open the window" would suggest a difference in power. The distinction between positive and negative politeness, as suggested by Brown and Levinson, has been extremely influential and has been taken up by many scholars. 20 years later, Helen Spencer Oaty, again a British linguist dealing with the phenomenon of politeness, suggested another distinction, namely that between what she called quality face and social identity face. Quality face refers to our first expectations to be seen and treated positively as an individual and connects with Brown and Levinson's starting point. Social identity face, on the other hand, relates to our roles in groups, organizations, and in society. Here's an example. Contradicting your professor will be seen as a violation of your professor's social identity face in some cultures and will not go without consequences. In other cultures, however, telling your professor you don't agree with him or her will be considered absolutely normal. In other words, the same type of communication would be seen as a face-threatening act in some cultures and as absolutely normal and acceptable communication in others. The term social identity phase introduced an important aspect into the discussion which will prove helpful in our context. Brown and Levinson's analysis of politeness also met with criticism. One critical question referred to the prominent role of language in their analysis. Or, to put it differently, is politeness purely a language phenomenon, or aren't there other things which may play a role? Look at the Scrabble pieces on this slide. The sentence, "I beg your pardon," may be considered extremely polite or the opposite, depending on the situation, the speakers involved, and the tone of voice in which it is said. So it seems quite clear that while language may play an important role, politeness is not purely in language. In other words, it means more than polite or impolite language. Instead, we will need to look at other aspects too if we want to understand what politeness is and how it works, both at home and internationally. Let us assume the following scenario. From books on international etiquette, you have learned that for Chinese, Japanese and other Asian business people, the exchange of business cards is done in a different way than we normally do it in Europe. If you want to show respect towards your Asian business partners, you will need to receive their card using both hands, bow slightly, and show appreciation by studying the card for 10 seconds or more before putting them away. This is one of the widely known conventional rules in much of Asia, and you would be well advised to comply with it. This relates to the first step at the bottom of the slide. Only after you have met the same person several times, and provided that you have succeeded in the course of negotiation and socializing in establishing a positive relationship, less formal behavior with each other will be acceptable to all sides, as indicated on level 2. In some cases, and only after having known each other for a considerable length of time, may a stage of intimacy be reached, as indicated on level 3, in which almost any behavior may be seen as acceptable, or even be seen as a confirmation of mutual trust. It is this sequence of establishing relationships which we will need to keep in mind when we look at the various forms and styles which polite communication may take. Based on what I've said so far, and by way of answering my first guiding question, let me suggest this definition of politeness. Clearly, this definition is a more general one and takes into account more aspects of human communication than indicated by Brown and Levinson. If politeness is seen as a process of establishing positive relationships through communication and interaction, much more than language alone needs to be taken into account. It is this approach which may serve as a basis for finding practical ways of dealing with the great diversity of politeness conventions which we are faced with in real life worldwide. One way of looking at politeness in particular has proved to be helpful in this context. Bruce Fraser, for example, emphasized that politeness was in fact the norm of social behavior in a given environment, namely a state that one expects to exist in every encounter. Consequently, participants would not note that someone is polite, but rather only the opposite, that is, that someone is violating what he called the conversational contract. Here are a few examples of what conversational contract means. People are expected to speak only in whispers, if at all, during a Protestant church service. Everyone is expected to address the US Chief Executive as Mr. President. And a witness in court is expected to speak only when questioned. You may call all these unwritten rules. Such requirements are seldom, if ever, renegotiated. A child, for example, is not normally entitled to authorize a parent to do something. Two close friends do not issue orders to each other. An employee is not free to criticize an employer. A convicted criminal does not christen a ship, etc. Conversational contracts can vary a great deal and will quite obviously depend on a number of things, as illustrated by the multi-layered model on this slide. Looking at this model, the conversational contract may depend on cultural conventions, on situational circumstances, on the people involved, or more precisely their identities, roles and relationships, and on the language used. It is true this makes it a complicated model, but then the world is complicated and requires a great deal of preparation. And perhaps this is the first golden rule to be learned in intercultural training courses: never be unprepared. What we would be looking for when preparing for intercultural and international business is what you may call a cultural default setting. A default setting is what is taken for granted, normal, or what applies when nothing else or more specific is agreed on. One example of this would be shaking hands when meeting a business partner for the first time, which is rapidly becoming the norm in many parts of the world. Being prepared means also acknowledging that conversational contracts are seldom made explicit. So we will have to find out, either by ourselves or, much better, with the help of experienced people or colleagues who know about these things from their own experience. Now the answer to my second guiding question should be equally clear. Concepts of politeness exist in fact in each and every culture, no matter where you travel, be it to New York City or the Amazon jungle, be it to Madrid or the capital city of the Democratic Republic of Congo. People will always have ideas of politeness and judge our and their own behavior on the grounds of these, explicitly or implicitly. Politeness concepts always include scales reaching from very polite to extremely impolite behavior. The difficulty lies in the fact that politeness scales from different cultures are not necessarily in accord with each other. In other words, what may appear polite in one culture may be seen as impolite or even completely unacceptable in another. Consequently, there is no alternative to learning, preparing, and getting ready. A few examples of what this implies will be given on the next slide. Conversational contracts define things that are taken for granted, normal, or what applies when nothing else or more specific is agreed on. An example of this would be the typically British way of requesting something as indicated on the top of this slide. From the three options given, only one will appear appropriate to most British or American speakers of English. But what about the formal ending of a business letter, which is mandatory in France until today? Veuillez, cher monsieur, agréer mes salutations distinguées. The English equivalent, may you please, dear sir, accept my most distinguished greetings, would be considered over the top or even ridiculous by readers of a different cultural background. Best regards, on the other hand, today a fairly conventional ending in English, would be considered inappropriate by most French business partners. The third example from Thai demonstrates once again that what is considered normal, appropriate, polite, or the opposite may vary from culture to culture. This becomes particularly clear when all involved use English as their mutual lingua franca. When everyone in the business world speaks English, different concepts of culture may become a source of serious misunderstandings. Here is another example. Turn-taking refers to how and when I signal to my partner in conversation that he or she may now have a turn, while I remain silent and listen. These conventions vary a lot internationally and may be the source of a great deal of misunderstanding. In Northern Europe and North America, for example, interrupting someone is often seen as extremely impolite and treated as taboo, which may lead to a crisis or even to the breakdown of a relationship. In some parts of Europe and large parts of the world, however, the same conversation style is seen as exactly the opposite. Here, interrupting your partner in conversation often signals appreciation, interest, and even enthusiasm. It may express something like, "I am enjoying our conversation, let's continue this way." it is mistakes connected with the cultural concepts hidden underneath the language which often are more serious than grammatical or pronunciation mistakes. Here is another example. In almost all English coursebooks today, Anglo-American politeness conventions are taught. The underlying assumptions being that since people speak English, Anglo-American politeness will be acceptable worldwide. That this is not necessarily so has been proven by a lot of empirical research. Take, for example, a typical Chinese convention in the field of compliment giving and receiving as given on the slide. Answer A is what learners are taught in traditional English language classes. This response would be absolutely acceptable in most parts of Europe and North America. In China, however, Confucian-based rules of modesty and self-depreciation may be expected. Against this background, accepting a compliment by saying thank you may mean that the speaker could be seen as an arrogant and conceited foreigner by his Chinese business partners. In fact, what most Chinese would expect as an adequate response is C, something that Westerners may find hard to adapt to. So perhaps B could be seen as a middle way, which would allow a Westerner to preserve his or her feeling of identity and yet meeting Chinese expectations halfway, thus avoiding to risk a positive relationship. By the way, the term middle way is worth remembering, as it indicates a strategy which may prove helpful in many intercultural environments. The final example is taken from business correspondence and demonstrates once again how the naive transfer of Anglo-American conventions to international communication may lead to crisis. Anglo-American strategies, as indicated on the left, have often been summarized by the acronym KISS, meaning keep it short and simple. In large parts of the world, however, a short message of request following this advice could be considered inappropriate, impolite, and overbearing. What a recipient would expect, on the other hand, is indicated on the right and includes a great deal of active face work, something that may feel alien to most Westerners and needs practice. Being polite worldwide is a real challenge which we need to prepare ourselves for. Being prepared for international business includes all the aspects on this list. As you will easily see, getting ready for international business means much more than the list of do's and don'ts which you can find on the internet. It means, in fact, that our success or failure in building positive relationships with international business partners depends on our practical communication skills, based on knowledge and personal adaptability. It should be clear that not being prepared in terms of politeness means risking the success of business relations and business projects. To make things even more complicated, social distance, for example in terms of status, age or gender, may prove particularly critical issues in international environments. How does a man greet a woman? Does he or she seek eye contact? How is hierarchy expressed in different cultures? How do we deal with difference in power? And don't forget, if everyone speaks English, do Anglo-American conventions concerning the use of first names apply? What should be clear by now is this. Preparing for polite communication in international and intercultural business includes at least 4 domains as indicated by this diagram. Firstly, knowledge about country specifics such as etiquette, taboos, or adequate strategies of trust building. Secondly, a state of mind characterized by openness, acceptance, and flexibility, which allows you to deal with unexpected or even irritating utterances or behavior without risking a relationship. Thirdly, envisioning the situation to expect, that is, most of all the persons you will be meeting, their identities, roles and relationships. And most importantly, fourthly, communication skills which, based on the above, enable me to establish a relationship of trust with my foreign business partners. Although this model may seem theoretical to you, it has practical consequences for communication. For one thing is clear. In international business, it is not intercultural knowledge alone, nor tolerance and acceptance which will guarantee success. But it is these two combined with thorough preparation and, most of all, communicative skills that will enable you to deal effectively with a great diversity of intercultural encounters. For it is always what you do and what you say what counts. Thank you for listening.